Thanks for checking back in. This is the third video in the series to rebuild the rear shocks on my Ford Raptor. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm about to go crazy with all this quarantine. But I am able to get a lot of work done on my project. What I'm doing here is I'm looking down into these cylinders, trying to understand how they work. And here's a little bit close-up of the nitrogen chamber down there. You can see the port that feeds the oil over into the oil chamber. And then this is the oil chamber. If I can get this camera to focus on this down there, it's not the simplest thing in the world to do. Now it's a little hard to understand what you're looking at, but right down in the very bottom of that there's a little orifice and a passageway from the oil side to the nitrogen side where you get your pressure can pass between the two. There's not a lot of oil transfer between the two, but I think the pressure passes. You can see the chamfer where the machine part of the bottom of that cylinder goes, so it's all a nice tight fit. So now we get to clamp it back up in the vise. My trusty little old vise from Harbor Freight here holds it up nice and neat. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that bottom, the piston for the nitrogen chamber, and I'm going to slide it down in there. Now I've got the O-ring there. I'm going to pop it around. Something I already did on the other shock in the previous video, but just to put that sealing O-ring in there, put the piston inside the nitrogen chamber, and the tricky part is getting that O-ring past the C-clip groove. It kind of catches in that groove, and you've got to put some force behind it. Now you can see here I got mine in there just a little bit crooked, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the basically extraction tool we built, and I'm going to thread that up in there, and that's going to give me a little more leverage to work this back and forth and pop it down past that, get it lined up where it'll pop past that C-clip groove. Now once I've got it lined up, and I thought I had it down in there far enough, I'm going to wrap this wear band around the top of that piston. This is what rides up inside there and keeps it all straight in the cylinder. And this wear band is not spring loaded, so it just straps around there, and you can see I have a little trouble holding it together, keeping it together, because it doesn't clip on like the previous one did for the oil piston. Now what I learned from this experience is the best thing to do is to push the cylinder down in there further and back it back up just a little bit. You can see I missed it with my first try, it popped off, but if you just back it back up to where that band is just above the top of the cylinder housing, then you strap it on. You don't have near as much time. It'll slide right down in there, and from there on it's pretty easy. Just push it down in. You can work it back and forth. Of course, you saw I had everything nice and oiled up so it can slide. So what I want to do now is take the cylinder for the oil piston, and you look at the machined end, you can see it real easy. There's also a couple of ports. There's 4 ports at the top of it, and then there's a valve on the side of it that you may or not been able to see, but it's basically just a metal shim that allows, when there's pressure, that it opens up and lets the pressure out from inside that cylinder. So you slide that down on it, kind of pops in place, and now we're just ready to fill the oil reservoir with oil. Now I'm going to fill it all the way up to the top of the cylinder. This is earlier in the previous video I was talking about how I was thinking about measuring it, but I decided this is a lot like a brake system and that it needs to have no air inside of it. So the way I figured it, I fill it up to the top of the cylinder where the oil should be, which is just a little bit, about 1/4 inch below the bottom of the threads. And then I'm kind of working the oil over into the nitrogen chamber below that nitrogen piston. So I pushed it all the way down to start with, and I pull it back up, and you'll hear it when you do that. You'll hear it pull that oil over into that chamber, and then push it all the way back down. You'll hear the air come back out over into the oil side. So you can work that back and forth a few times. This will remove the biggest part of the air out of this part of the system. And I say that because a little later on, after I get it all pressured up, I'm going to bleed the last little bit of the air. After it's sat overnight, I'm going to bleed off just the air that gathered up at the top of the 2 vents just before I remount this on the truck. So I was working along, making pretty good progress here, and my wife came out and said, hey, it's lunchtime, so I went in and had lunch. I closed those off so that they wouldn't get any kind of bugs or anything crawling down inside that shock. I didn't want that to happen. And while you're bleeding this system, if you'll hold your hand over that the oil side, the oil reservoir, it'll pull a vacuum when you raise up, and when you push down, you'll feel the pressure come back over. So you can kind of gauge the movement and the pressure you're feeling with that oil transferring back and forth out of that cylinder. So if you remember back at the beginning when I was tearing this down, I measured between the piston inside that nitrogen chamber. I measured to the top of the nitrogen reservoir, and it measured out 7.5 inches. I wrote it down on my bench so I would have it for this time. And what I'm doing now is I'm setting that nitrogen chamber depth to 7.5 inches, same distance that I had when I took it apart. Now that I've got that all done, I can pull my tool out of it, and I can go ahead and start and insert the top of that nitrogen cylinder and kind of close off that side of it. Now at this point the oil level's actually down a little bit from the top of that cylinder, but we're going to take care of that by topping this thing off just before we seal it all up, so I'm not too worried about that. The thing I want to make sure of is I got a good seal between the nitrogen piston and the oil so it's not bleeding over into it, and then I want to make sure I've got good seals to the outside and around the piston shaft so that there's no leaks. And we're going to test that overnight with some. You can see in this video laying over there on the bench behind me is the first shock I rebuilt with the gauge still on it. It's been sitting there for a whole week, just making sure it holds the same pressure that I left it with, and it's been perfect so far. So now I'm getting the nitrogen cylinder cap pushed in, push it down. It's got actually 2 O-rings on it, and I'm pushing them both down, the whole thing down below the C-clip, so now I can put the C-clip in. And here you'll notice that I actually have my new C-clip pliers that I made out of an old pair of 90-degree needle nose pliers, and it worked a whole lot better than my little AutoZone pair that I had. So now you'll notice that the schrader valve is not in that cap. I wanted to leave that available to vent, but I also left it out for another reason, and it was really just my own curiosity. So here what I'm doing is making sure that cylinder is pushed down in there tight, and I'm going to run that piston over into that cylinder. And this is where I was talking about the oil level is lower, but this piston and all this shock is going to displace quite a bit of oil out of this tube, and it's going to get it back up close to the top of that cylinder. So if you had it too full, it would actually begin overflowing here. We've got the piston inside the cylinder working it up and down. You can see the oil kind of bubbling up to the top as I move it up back and forth. And you'll notice I actually have a rod in the nitrogen cylinder where the schrader valve would go. I ran the rod over into that chamber, and I was actually watching that rod. I marked it at a 7.5 inch depth, and I wanted to see if when I moved that piston up and down, if it actually moved that nitrogen piston up and down as well, which it did not. So now that I've got the piston and that in there, I'm going to just top the oil reservoir off just to the very bottom of the threads. This is not an easy feat with a single person trying to hold the piston and fill it up, but you can get it done. So with the piston in place now, I'm just going to slide that nut on the top of that piston shaft, slide it down over, and you've got to get it down past, it's got an O-ring, remember, at the bottom on the outside, so you got to get that past that initial top of the oil reservoir, which is what I'm doing here, just popping it down so the threads can be engaged. And now I was satisfied that nothing had moved that nitrogen chamber, so I pulled that out. And now it's just a matter of cleaning up a little bit of the oil. And I've left the vents open during this time so that the oil can start wicking out as I screw this down. You'll start seeing oil come out of those vents. Now it's just a matter of taking the spanner wrench and going round and round, screwing this down all the way down and then tightening it up. There is not a set screw. Those 2 vents on the top of this nut are just that, they're vents. I know some off-road shocks actually do have set screws that you run it down and then you crank it down. It keeps it from backing off. But that is not the case. Those 2 nuts are just vents. Lots of threads. Just take your time and work it down in there. And you have basically gotten the shock back together at this point. It's a complete unit, although with no schrader valve in the nitrogen chamber. Now, just getting this tightened up, and I know in watching this movie I started thinking to myself, I probably shouldn't have been pushing on the top of that piston. I probably should have been pushing on the body of the shock itself. That can't be good on that piston, on that seal in the top of that nut. But Anyway, I did it, so we'll see how it holds up, and I'll come back and tell you later on how it did. And here's where you can see the oil starting to weep out of those holes right there at the top with those vents being open. What I'm going to do is clean that up, and I'm going to take the schrader valve. I'm going to put the plumber's tape around the schrader valve, get it threaded into the top of that nitrogen cap, get it tightened up. Now, I almost didn't put plumber's tape on this. You'll see me start to put this schrader valve in there. You get busy and you get to thinking about different things, but I caught it I started threading it in there, and I noticed that it didn't have it on there. So I went over and got the plumber's tape, put a couple of wraps around those pipe threads. If you don't put plumber's tape on there, it's going to leak. There's just nothing in the way for that pipe thread to seal. So that tape helps take care of that for you. I guess what I'm saying is it helps to pay attention and to double check yourself, because you can make mistakes. So I got my plumber's tape here. All it takes is if you put too much on there, it'll kind of make a mess too. So you just a couple of wraps around those threads and then thread it in there and tighten it up. Now you will notice that the top of that nitrogen chamber is actually down below that C-clip. The C-clip's in nice and tight, so it won't come out. Once I get this schrader valve in place and tightened up, I've already got the oil reservoir tightened up and in place, so we'll be able to just bump a little bit of air pressure into that nitrogen pressure actually, and that pressure will pop that top cap for that nitrogen chamber right up against that C-clip. You do want to make sure your C-clip's in there well, or it'll pop it right back out of there. So now that all that's installed, here is the nitrogen. I've got a little tank over there on the side under my bench, and I'm going to put just a little bit, not a whole lot of pressure, just enough to pop that up. So 20 to 40 pounds, and it'll be plenty. It'll pop it right back up there. Want to make sure that you do close off these vents so they don't start pushing a lot of oil out. We'll come back and crack them just a little bit after we've laid this there on the bench for a while. Once I get those vents all closed off, I'm going to take that air chuck and I'm going to pop that cap up. And once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and dial the air pressure up to about 120 or so, and I'm going to shoot high pressure into this. And when I do that, you'll notice that the piston will actually raise up. You see it go up there in the video from that pressure, and that's the oil pressure and the reservoir pushing that piston up. Now, a lot of questions that I get asked is, well, where do you get the tools? Where do you get the things to do this? You'll notice over there on the ground behind me is a really small little nitrogen bottle that I bought thinking, well, I'm going to need something that I can just check the air pressure on these shocks. Like I said before, I think that's what kind of got me in trouble, is the nitrogen pressure got down and then the shock just quit functioning. So I think that's something you're going to have, or you're going to have a place that motorcycle shops can fill these nitrogen shocks, but I just thought it was nice to have it available to me. Something else you're going to need is what I've got here, and it's a no-loss air gauge, pressure gauge. If you don't have this, every time you took a pressure reading with a tire pressure tool or whatever, you would lose 5 or 10 pounds. The nitrogen reservoir on this shock is so small that even just a little bit of pressure loss will drop it quite a bit. Now, I've had this one laying around my shop for a while. I use it. Used to use it on motorcycles and things like that when I was doing shocks there, so it comes in handy here. I did have to use a valve stem extension on it, so it's something I've had again for a while. If you don't have that valve stem extension on this gauge, you cannot depress the valve inside that air chuck, so you'll never get air through the gauge to the tire, or in this case the nitrogen chamber on this shock. So here what I'm doing is I'm cranking the pressure way up to about 240 psi, and I'm going to leave this setting here overnight. And just watch for oil leaks, and I want to see if the pressure bleeds off overnight, so that way I know I have a nitrogen leak. One of the things I recognized when I started trying to make this video for YouTube is I did not capture myself bleeding the air out of the system. So if you're following these videos, just make sure that somewhere before you put the shock back on the truck is that you crack those two vents just a little bit, and the air will bubble right out of them, and then oil will start coming out. Now here what I'm trying to do is capture that the pressure remained overnight, and so they're good. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to start getting them ready to put them back on the truck. I've got to take the air gauge off this shock, got to get the guards put back on them, and then mount them back on the truck. But before I get to that, I want to show a little bit about what this cost me to get to this point in the build for tools and consumables to do this job. So the tools you're going to need, there's just certain things, like I said when I started this job, there's just certain tools you've got to have or you cannot get the job done. So these are the ones that I collected prior to starting the job. And this is the one piece that most people need when they're trying to decide whether to do the job themselves or farm it out. So here's just a picture, capture of all the different things that I had to have to do this. And if you're watching, I'm going to bounce different things up here that talk the no-loss air gauge, the nitrogen regulator, the nitrogen tank, the spanner wrench, which was absolutely required. Obviously the shock rebuild kits and the oil that you needed, kind of the consumables of the project, and then the bullet was the last thing that was necessary, or at the very least, nice to have. So I rounded up most of these things prior to starting the build so I would have them available. I had to go get the nitrogen tank refilled. That was about 12 bucks. So here's kind of the cost of everything involved. And so yeah, it looks a little high, but when you consider $235 of that is tools, there's only $122 of consumables. The tools I will reuse. I'm going to rebuild my front shocks, and I'll probably have to rebuild these shocks again. I keep my vehicles a long time, 200,000 miles plus on most of them, and I'll probably have to rebuild these shocks again. But I figure every 50,000 miles or so I'm going to be using all these tools again, so they'll pay for themselves. So if the rebuilds have to happen, and my only option is to outsource this to someone else at a cost of about $500 a pair plus the shipping, I figure I'm better off to do it myself, and then I will have the ability to come in and play with the nitrogen pressure in these shocks and raise it and lower it and see how that changes the ride quality of my truck, which is something I could never do before, but I knew it wasn't quite right some of the time. So this should be an interesting another piece of the truck that I can play with, so I'm looking forward to that. So we got the shocks ready to go back on the truck. I put the guards back on with the little shims that fell out when we started the build. And here all I'm doing is showing that the shock held pressure overnight at 220 psi after I had bled off the air. This is the pressure I decided I'm going to run on this truck starting out. So now it's time to remount the shocks on the truck, and one of the things you're going to learn really quickly is you cannot compress these shocks at 220 psi. So I'm jacking the truck up to get the full extension on the suspension. Obviously, jacking up any vehicle is a dangerous situation, so take precautions when doing this. But what I'm doing now is I'm feeding the shocks in from the top through the fender well, and I'm going to hang the shocks off of the top bolt into the frame mount, and then they're going to hang there, and I'll be able to jack the truck up even further, in this case side to side, so that we can get it up high enough to put the bolt into the bolt hole on the axle. I enlisted the help of my son to jack the truck up while I'm laying underneath it and just watching where the shock is at compared to the axle, and we'll get it up high enough that I can start that bolt. Now he did have to come over and push down on the axle a little bit to get full extension, so I could get the bolt through the bottom of the shock. That worked out fairly well. Once I've got that shock on both sides on the bottom, tighten up the nut and the bolt using just an impact wrench and then a couple of wrenches just to make sure. I've never really been fond of impact wrenches, just running things down as tight as you can. I always kind of like to do it by hand, so I kind of feel how tight I'm getting. And then the last thing is to come around and make sure that you tighten up the top bolt, because all I did was hang it off loosely. So both sides are going to tighten these up, and then we're good to go. We can go out and start driving the truck and see how it does. Now the next project I'm going to do is I'm going to tackle the front shocks, getting them off the truck and getting those rebuilt, and I'll post those up here as well. I want to thank you for watching the video, and let me know what you think about these videos below and anything that I'm missing or should add to them.